This is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek, speaking about the struggle in Korea, the lessons for the Korean working class in the situation that they're in the new world COVID battle against COVID, and also against companies and corporations and governments that are attacking workers. So welcome to WorkWeek, Wol-san.
Thank you.
Why don't you talk first? Korea has a tremendous history of labor militancy and fighting against massive repression by the government. And you've had some major victories with the defeat of Park Geun-hye, the president, who actually is in prison as a result of your struggle and the struggle of millions of other Koreans. This struggle against privatization, against the attacks on labor, what were the lessons learned from the struggle against Park Geun-hye?
For the COVID period, that's interesting. I actually think, so you're right that Korea has, the Korean labor movement has a history of and a tradition of militant struggle. It's a fairly young labor movement compared to the United States or Europe. But I think more so from drawing lessons from the struggle against Park Geun-hye, which was actually, it was really a popular movement which the labor movement contributed to, and it was, as opposed to led, I think, although, tried to play the role of lifting up workers' voices and particular social issues in that context. But the Park Geun-hye, the fight for the impeachment or the removal of the Park Geun-hye government was, it was sparked by corruption, the corruption of the regime, and there were a broad range of forces involved, including people who are not very, left, and were really just kind of interested in the fall of or the disintegration of formal, representative democracy. And so I think instead of drawing lessons from that struggle, really we're looking more to what has happened when there have been past economic crises, and past economic crises have called on the labor movement to respond. And that would be the IMF crisis, 1990s, the Asian financial crisis sparking IMF bailout of Korea in 1996-97, and then 2008, 2009. And one of the important lessons for us at those times is that the Korean labor movement fought hard, but really ended up fighting for the jobs and the security of workers who are already unionized and employed in permanent, directly employed relationships. And that was when we saw a lot of labor flexibilization, the creation of a vast class of precarious workers, and then workers who are in subcontracted or other forms of precarious employment are the ones who were laid off first. And so we're trying to create a movement and approach now where we are, trying to protect all workers, and we're trying to make sure that workers who are in the most vulnerable positions have the support and the protection they need. It's not easy, right? But that, I think it's a change in perspective.
And one of the critical struggles in Korea was the Korean Railway Workers Union and their fight against privatization. That was successful. And why don't you talk about that struggle, because that was an important milestone in protecting public services in Korea.
The Korean Railway Workers Union, which is an affiliate of the KPTU, my union, has been fighting privatization for the last 20 years or so. And so, as I mentioned, the IMF bailout of Korea, that sparked a drive towards privatization. And since then, there's been a fight against rail privatization, other public sector privatization. The big struggle that you're mentioning was, I think in 2013 is the one you're referring to, and where the government was, at that time, conservative government, driving to split up the railway as a step towards privatization. And there was a very long strike at that time for over 20 days. And it led to public support for the public rail, public services, and also anger at the government. And so as we've moved forward since then, it's been very hard for successive regimes to talk about privatization. And because of the broad public understanding of the importance of the public rail. And I think that is important in this period because while we didn't see the shutdown of rail or public transport services that you're seeing in some cities in the around the world, I guess actually more in developing countries, Southeast Asia, a lot of the public transport has just been stopped. I think in New York or other places in the U.S., the public transport is seeing huge deficits, right? Because it has to keep running to uh, provide transport for patients and essential service workers, but there are less riders, right? That's happening in Korea. So I think what we're going to see a little bit out of this phase of the corona crisis is an attack on public transport, other public services, attempt at austerity, attempt at cutting the workforce, possibly drives towards privatization. And I think right now we're recognizing the need to, in the midst of this very difficult situation, put out a really strong pro-public line and to stress the importance of maintaining these essential public services because we're likely to see more crisis and they're essential in the future, and that also the public sector can be an area for job creation in this period of a jobs crisis.
And the effort of the government now in the United States to Trump government to shut down or the post office is obviously a major attack on public workers in the United States that working people are now facing. So the situation also in Korea, you have a high percentage of temporary workers, gig workers. And why don't you talk about that and the struggle in the unions to fight to represent them in this period of temporary workforce, part-timers?
There's a broad range of precariously employed workers. I think roughly 50% of the workforce is in some form of precarious employment, which ranges from dependent self-employed, like you mentioned, gig workers, other forms of like owner drivers or owner operators, as well as temporarily employed or subcontracted workers, all of whom are more easily laid off, more easily become victims within the context of the COVID-19, both health and then the economic and jobs crisis. And in the first period, when the health and workplace health and safety issues were the most important for us, we and our affiliates did a lot of work to demand that precariously employed, self-employed workers had the PPE they needed, were covered by health and safety guidelines. And now going into the period where we're really looking at a jobs crisis and a loss of income, we're trying very hard to both there are various forms of government support available now, but it's hard for various reasons for precarious workers to get that support. And so we're trying to both pressure the government to make the support available and then help workers or push employers who are employing these workers to apply for the support so they can get it. Expand the support so workers can apply for it themselves rather than depend on their employers to apply for it. So that's going on now. But as we go forward, we're going to have to, on a more structural level, we are demanding that employment insurance is expanded so that self-employed workers can also access it, and other forms of workers in small companies that aren't registered with the employment insurance. So we're calling for the restructuring of the system of unemployment and then other forms of social insurance to cover these workers. And of course, there's going to be an organizing task as we go forward.
And of course, one of the big issues for Americans is the 27 million people who are unemployed don't have health insurance. And health insurance in the United States is tied to your employment, which means these workers are basically on their own. And I think that it's very important for Americans to know how was Korea able to deal with the COVID crisis and your union especially, but apparently your healthcare workers were able to get PPE, were able to get protection, and you were able to, with your national healthcare system, to deal with it in a better way. Why don't you talk about the different experiences in Korea around that?
So I think that the problem of PPE is global. And that is because PPE production is actually, driven by, it's a market, right? So it's driven by profit and not by need. And that means that there were shortages, and there were shortages in Daegu and uneven distribution in Daegu where the virus hit the most strongly early on. And we spent a lot of time hounding employers and hospitals to access and get the PPE and redistribute PPE from areas where it wasn't needed to where it was, and make sure that precariously employed workers could get it. And so that's similar. I think the scale is worse in the United States, but what we do have the United States doesn't have is we have a national health insurance plan, a public health insurance plan, which everybody accesses, and that means that workers are able, I mean, the testing was largely paid for. And assuming that you meet certain criteria and that treatment is largely covered, and that resource was available to the government to be able to do a wide range of testing, more testing than the United States did early on. And that, I mean, I think that's a huge difference between what you're experiencing in the United States. That there are all of these workers now who, you know, aren't even able to go to the hospital. If they can't go to the hospital, then, you know, they may have COVID-19, or they may have other diseases, right? And they're left without any support, and that's a huge difference here. For us now, the big demand around healthcare is the expansion of publicly owned and operated hospitals, of which there are very few in Korea. And so to have hospitals that are serving the public interest and particularly are able to deal with infectious disease. So we're going to be, as we go forward, calling for expansion of public hospital capacity, and then also expansion of the public healthcare workforce.
And of course, these private hospitals have been fighting your union, the right of their members to unionize. You've been in some very bitter struggles over workers trying to organize these private hospitals. And there was a religious cult apparently that kept this secret. Why don't you talk about that? Because you have religious groups in this country, right-wing religious groups, who say that they're not going to get the disease and they can go out and mingle. And in fact, they're getting support from President Trump. So why don't you talk about your experience with?
Sure. The early except for a few isolated cases, the early outbreak of COVID-19 happened within a particular cult or a religious sect called Shincheonji, and why it hit that particular sect first. I mean, I think some of it obviously had to do with their overseas activities. Some of it had to do with the fact that they were not, you know, thinking that they could get the virus. Had to do with the way that they carry out prayer groups in very small, closed spaces, and with a lot of singing and shouting, I guess, and that there's a lot of secrecy, and so it took a while to figure out who had, you know, first contracted by where it had spread to. And there was a lot of targeting of this particular religious groups, especially by other religious figures, that they were, you know, they were not cooperating with the government, and that they were secretive and, you know, liars in the way they go out to convert other people. And you know, on the some one hand, I think, you know, probably a lot of the criticisms are true. On the other hand, it's not isolated to one religious group, and a lot of the problems or elements that allowed the virus to spread in this one group is true for other, you know, other religious groups. And I don't want to make this about religion at all. I think what I'm trying to say that is that without diminishing culpability, there was also a scapegoating of a particular group to sort of say by other elements in society that were different from you, when in fact there was, you know, there were some universal problems going on. So yeah, it's a complicated story.
And your members, you were saying, have been having to fight for PPE. What kind of fights did you have around getting protection for your members? Because in the United States, there are nurses, there are doctors who've died. People are putting garbage bags on their bodies to protect themselves. One guy at Highland Hospital here in Oakland, in the Bay Area, Alameda, was fired because a Facebook page of him and his bag was circulated. Have you had, what kind of problems did your union have in fighting to protect your own members?
Well, and I do think the scale of what's going on in the United States is much worse for us. When the crisis first hit, we issued guidelines to all of our branches in hospitals and other workplaces to call for a meeting of health and safety committees immediately to talk about how to distribute PPE, how to make sure that all workers in the workforce were aware of what was going on, what safety measures were needed. And we found that in the workplaces where those health and safety committee meetings happened, then management knows more what's going on the floor, right, in the workplace, and can respond to that. Where that in a lot of places, in a lot of hospitals, the management refused to meet with workers and with the union about what the best safety procedures would be. And that's where we saw the problems of workers not getting the PPE they needed, workers not being informed about what was going on. And so in those cases, we did a lot of media work. So we did press conferences online, offline, with masks on. Um, or just putting out press statements, these kinds of things that would put pressure on the employer to act. And that was actually quite effective in a lot of cases. It was because of that pressure, I think, that we were eventually, for example, able to get like employer business association of hospitals to issue guidance to hospitals to distribute PPE to self-employed workers in the hospital as well. So yeah.
And in the United States, transit workers particularly have lost a large number of lives, 60 in New York and growing. They've been infected. They weren't provided with masks, even though they had masks for a possible pandemic. They said that the CDC, they were following the CDC rules, which have been downgraded by Trump. What did you do in transit in particular to make sure that the transit workers were protected, where they come into contact with passengers and close contacts at some point?
So our affiliates in rail and metro also called for these meetings of the health and safety committees with employers. They did happen in the rail union as well as in our Seoul subway union, and in those meetings, our unions, our affiliates, were again making clear that. Specifically what sorts of disinfectant processes of disinfection needed to happen for not only vehicles but also office space and workers' rest facilities, and to make sure that that these conditions and safety measures and PPE distribution would apply to subcontracted workers as well as directly employed workers. We have not had the problem that you've had in public transport, and it kills me to see how many healthcare workers and public transport workers in the United States are dying. We haven't had deaths among our members in either healthcare or public transport. And for the most part, PPE in public transport has been distributed and disinfection is going on well. The problem has been for workers who are subcontracted cleaning workers, cleaning station staff, their work hours and the intensity of their work has become quite severe. So that's an issue. And then also in buses, we had a problem of, because our bus companies are private, shutting down services and a loss of work time and income for those workers. And so that's leading us to call for the public ownership and operation of the buses. Yeah.
So you're now calling for public ownership of the bus transportation system in Korea.
Actually, we were calling for that before the COVID-19 crisis, but we are calling for it now more in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. Yeah.
And have any of your members in healthcare died?
No, we have had none of it. There have been healthcare workers who have died, and those numbers are not made public, so I can't give you a figure, but we don't have members who have died.
So that's a tremendous victory.
Yeah, it's a huge difference. Yeah.
For your union. I mean, what a powerful statement that you haven't had one member die, when in the United States, they're dying all over the country.
Yeah, and again, I think, and I am not an expert, and there are so many pieces of this that have to be analyzed to say, what did and didn't work. And I think it's simplistic to just the line in the media that the Korean government did sort of everything right and tested a lot, and and it's a model case is too simplistic. There are a lot of other factors going on, and I guess it is true that the testing did happen on a rapid scale early on, and that there has been a lot of contact tracing in the United States, unlike in the United States. So in Korea, there's the level of contact tracing is much higher. The reasons that that's possible is, maybe a higher level of surveillance, for example, that exists in Korean society. There's some cultural differences. The scale of the country is different. I know that the U.S. unions are also fighting very hard to get PPE and protections for members. I think the work that our healthcare division did to fight helped in protecting the lives of our members.
And the United States, both Democrats and Republicans now are blaming China, saying it's Chinese Wuhan disease. What is the view of your union about this crisis and who to blame?
The same thing has happened in South Korea, that the right has called this is a problem of China. Wuhan still uses the word Wuhan coronavirus, and also used that to attack the current government is a liberal democratic government, and the right in Korea made a big deal of the fact that the government did not shut the border with China immediately, or hasn't fully shut the border with China to as a way to attack the government. For us, we have an analysis of indeed the problems of live animal production and consumption as a part of the capitalist system in China that led to the spread of the disease. But this is less my union's analysis, but that analysis exists within the Korean left. But that clearly, it is not a good thing to blame a specific country or a specific group of people for a problem that is a global problem. That is, pandemics are they are a feature of modern globalized capitalism, and will continue to be. And what is needed is exactly what is not needed is scapegoating, blaming, closing cooperation, and and sort of protectionism. And what is needed is global solidarity and cooperation. And so we're trying very much to resist any kind of scapegoating and targeting. And just in the United States, right? It was targeting of China has meant targeting East Asian people, right? And definitely
xenophobia, blaming Asians, and that kind of thing.
And so that's a feature of a larger problem of xenophobia and hate that has to be fought if we're going to be able to fight the COVID crisis.
Now, one of the hardest hit segments of the economy have been the airline industry, and of course, in the globalized world, airline workers are an important part of the global economy. And how has that affected Korea as far as the airline industry and what's happened to the airline workers?
In Korea, it's the same situation as everywhere in the world. Our main international airport is Incheon Airport. The passenger travel through Incheon Airport has dropped by 95%, right? So it's almost shut down, which means a majority of the workers, both directly employed and contracted, are either on paid or unpaid leave, right? Or they've been laid off, or they've been asked to resign or take early retirement. And so it's a huge problem. And our response has been both on a regional level and then on an industrial level. So we formed a branch for any worker that has a problem in the Incheon Airport region, whether or not they're in our sectors. So we have members that now from casinos in the area that have been hit, and workers in the hospitality industry in that area, because the entire area is shutting down, right? And we're calling for the region to be labeled an employment crisis zone, which would enable support for the entire region, not just aviation workers, but other workers affected in the region. And then we're also on an industrial level calling for conditions to be put on bailout money to airlines and other companies in the aviation industry to maintain employment, as is in the CARES Act in the United States, limit executive pay, prohibit payment of dividends while workers are not being paid. And we're having fights on the ground now for workers, particularly subcontracted workers who are facing layoffs. We are back in the streets now protesting.
And how are you protesting because of the limits on protest, and how your unions
Yeah.
dealt?
Before I get to that, I missed one really important condition which you didn't get in the CARES Act, which is that we're calling for conditions on aviation companies not to cancel contracts with contractors now, because even if a contractor has received funds, if the contract is canceled, right, that company goes out of business and that affects workers. So that's an important piece for us, which I know is a problem in the US. In terms of protests now, because social distancing is being loosened in Korea now, it's being lifted. We're not having big mass protests like the ones you often see in Korea, but we are having pickets, with a social distancing maintained and people wearing protection, um, and doing that in front of aviation. The headquarters companies. You will see that happening on May Day, as well as the labor departments that are responsible for the labor department that's responsible for the Incheon airport region. We've had lots of press conferences, sort of protest-like press conferences, both indoors and outdoors. We brought airport aviation workers to picket when, for example, the Minister of Labor was visiting the Labor Department in the airport region to meet with employers. So we picketed and handed over our demands. Those kinds of protests. So they're not the big scale Korean protests you're used to, but they're also, they're real protest actions. Yeah.
And this economic catastrophe, collapse of capitalism globally, it may last for years. In the
Yeah.
United States,
Yes, that's what we expect. Yeah.
devastating. And what is that going to mean for the working class, the labor movement, as far as survival of the working class? Because large numbers of the working people, I mean, this is the greatest collapse since the Depression, maybe even greater than the Depression. Has only been a month and a half since it's really hit the United States. What is the view of the unions and working people about survival of the working class in this midst of this massive economic collapse?
We've been having a debate in the labor movement about whether this is going to be a V-shaped recovery, or I don't know if you're having this debate in the United States, or an L-shaped recession. And I think that everybody realizes now that we're in for an L, right? It doesn't bounce back up, right? And that means that our response has to be different than if it was going to be a quick rebound. And I think what we're trying to talk about, although it's not easy, is the need to develop solidarity within the working class in terms of the demands that we put forth. And so there are two different pieces of it. That's one piece of it, which means that, for example, we would want to prioritize employment demands over wage demands. And so one of the things that we are trying to be self-reflective about in comparison to past crises is that when high-paid, permanently employed workers in large factories fight really hard to protect their wages in a crisis, that it's easy for subcontracted workers to be sacrificed, right? And so we need to develop demands that are about the entire, not just on a workplace level, but on an industry and an economy level, that are about that make it possible to maintain employment and conditions for everybody, as opposed to for the privileged group. And that goes for not just like private sector, but also in the public sector. So one of our demands is for expansion of employment to absorb, the unemployment problem. So to absorb, a lot of people are out of work, to create more employment in the public sector. In order to do that, this is a debate within KPTU. So this is one perspective within KPTU. The wage scale, which privileges in the unlike the United States and Korea, privileges seniority. The wage scale has to be made more equal, to allow for more employment and for more equality between younger and older workers, for example. So we're thinking about that. That's one thing. And then the other thing is, that's sort of an internal goal, is to build unity around like solidarity wage, solidarity employment demands on a sort of an external level. We have to think about, if the economy is going to be restructured, how do we think the economy should be restructured, right? And so that is, for us, it's about expansion of jobs in public health as well as the public health capacity. It's about expansion of public services and fighting back against austerity. We're trying to think about how we think the aviation industry should be restructured to be more sustainable, both for workers and for the industry, I mean, as an industry. And so those are discussions we're just starting to have now, but those are real tasks, I think, for the working class. And the one other thing is that there are voices within the movement talking about more public ownership and democratic control, and also worker control over companies. For example, the possibility of where companies go bankrupt for workers to take over and have cooperative-like situations in order to develop working class capacity and self-control and self-management. It's a debate within the labor movement, not an official KPT
And
position.
that's one of the things that you have apparently in the KCTU and your union, that in the United States, there are really not these kind of debates inside the unions in an organized way. And talk about how you have these debates, because the kind of top-down corporate structure of the unions make it very difficult for workers to have communication, debate on these issues.
Yeah, well, I think that the problem of, a disconnect between what's going on in head offices and what's going on the ground is a problem of unions all over the place. And I don't think the Korean labor movement's level of debate and breadth in terms of the level of rank and file involvement is as good as some unions, for example, maybe in Southern Europe or in Latin America. But what we've been doing, there have been we have, what do you call it, debate forums all the time where we have both internal presenters and external presenters come in to talk about the nature of the crisis, how we expect the crisis to unfold, different aspects, social insurance. We've had debates about what we understand to be going on in the aviation industry, and we prepare for them. It's not just people talking. I mean, people prepare information in papers, written papers. So they usually have, documents associated with them, very different from the United States. But I think the question is first of all, that they're not happening enough, even at the leadership level. The level of understanding and engagement is really different. And then the question of how that gets down to those discussions and the content, and then, the conclusions of these discussions get down to, and there's feedback from rank and file members, I think is a really big problem. It's a challenge, especially, for a long time we couldn't move around very well as well. And so the first thing I think that we need to do right now is education. And so we put out education leaflets, right, from our union, but then also create a curriculum to take to our membership and then use that as a forum for debate. And we haven't been able to do that yet, and we're just talking about the need to do it right now.
You have heard probably today, Trump announced that he's going to use the Defense Industry Act to require the opening of the meatpacking plants without requiring health and safety for the workers. In other words, they should go back to work without a requirement that the companies, the billionaire owners of Smithfield and these other companies, don't protect workers. What do you think about that action?
Yeah, I mean, we've been watching the news also of right-wing, forces calling for reopening of the economy without regard to the fact that this is an ongoing health crisis. And it's on the one hand, as a working class, we're stuck in a position where we have to both defend health and safety and worry about health and safety, and then also worry about, having a working economy and having jobs and everything, but that you would sacrifice workers in that way, and that there would be voices in support of that is, it's unthinkable, and it is angering. And, I am in full support of the labor movement in the United States calling for the health and safety protections and taking the crisis seriously in the way that it needs to be.
Well, your union has called for general strikes. In fact, those general strikes were part of the removal of the Park Geun-hye government. What are the lessons of those struggles for the American working class, which is confronted with a out-of-control government, a government that wants a dictatorship, accuses press of being scum, is saying there's complete control? That's what the president says. He has complete control, and he'll do what he wants. What are your thoughts about that and the lessons from the struggle of the Korean working class against another repressive government?
Right. This may not be the answer you want, but I think it's easy for people in the United States and around the world to look at Korean protests and say, look, they do massive national protests. We need to do that too. And yes, I mean, yes, I think it would be good if there was an ability to mobilize on that scale in the United States, but there are both cultural and geographical and all sorts of other differences that makes national protests the movement form, the protest form in Korea, and maybe it's going to be more difficult for us in the future, but and you know, and than it is in the U.S. I think what I want to say is that, I mean, what happened after the impeachment of the Park Geun-hye government was that a democratic government took power, and the democratic government is not putting forth real solutions. You know, there are, of course, some things that, you know, obviously are, you know, better than Trump. But we were not ready with our own alternatives in terms of government, in terms of uh, a vision of a new system. You know, we have certain demands, but it was not enough to create a real revolution, right, um, of the society and economy we lived in, despite that massive uprising. And I think, you know, we're in a moment where national working classes and the global working class has to have real discussions about alternatives, economic systems, social systems, and that's not something that anybody has an answer to right now. But I think shying away from those discussions and being dependent on the Democratic Party is not going to support. It's not going to help us in the long run. That's true in Korea as it is in the United States. So.
And there's also, of course, the danger of war, militarization. There's a blockade of North Korea, and for expansion of the military, both by Democrats and Republicans who are saying we have to pivot to Asia and militarize Asia. Jeju, they want to have a military base. In fact, there are aircraft carriers where they're contaminated or they've been contaminated with the virus and they're still operating. What is the view of your union towards militarization, towards war threats, towards the sanctions on Korea, for that matter, or Iran, or Venezuela, or other countries that are desperate to have medical supplies and you know, protection from this COVID epidemic?
For North Korea, you know, there is not a lot of information about what COVID-19 means in North Korea right now. So the sanctions are a problem, of course, and for humanitarian reasons and other reasons, the KCTU, the trade union movement, has been opposed to sanctions, and that is our position, right? But it's deeper than that. I think the problem, clearly, the whole geopolitical situation, which has a lot to do with U.S. militarism, the threat of a preemptive strike from the United States, a history of conflict between the United States and North Korea, the United States' involvement in the Korean War, means that North Korea is incredibly isolated. Not that there aren't, of course, problems with the North Korean regime, which should definitely be, you know, have to be considered in this situation, but the reality is that the country is incredibly isolated. There's sanctions, you know, on it, and we don't even, we're in a situation we don't have information about, you know, the level of the pandemic in North Korea, and that's a very, very, very scary situation, and it's not good situation humanitarian wise, and so of course sanctions need to be lifted, but also the fundamental political conflict, which is a nuclear conflict between North Korea and the United States, needs to be addressed, and that, I mean, it's something that the Korean trade union movement has been working around and calling for. It's been very difficult, despite leadership summits, you know, a couple of years ago. But yeah, so that's it's a difficult situation. I just, as you brought up this question, two other things. One is, you know, there's been this negotiations. There are several tens of thousands of U.S. troops stationed in South Korea. The United States Trump government is asking South Korea to pay more for the stationing of those troops. That where the labor movement and broader social forces are trying to resist that. So that is a conflict that's going on. And I wanted to mention, I've been looking at what unions in other countries are saying, and I noticed the CGT in France, the metal workers union, has been calling for an end to military production because it's not an essential service at this time, and that factory capacity should be reorganized to for health, production in the healthcare industry of healthcare imaging and other, things that serve health and human basic needs. And I think that it's a really beautiful demand and an important struggle that's going on there. So it's something I think the U.S. could learn from.
And that's significant since the $700 billion budget, military budget of the United States seems to keep growing despite the collapse of the infrastructure, the economic poverty, the homelessness, the entire dire situation of the working class in the United States, that so much money is being spent on the military while people are tremendously suffering. And what are your plans for May Day, and how are you going to organize it? And you usually have mass rallies with big stages, and your social media, you use video, you use dancing and technology and culture. I remember the first time I was in Korea, an 8-hour KCTU stadium, or Korean television stadium, for 8 hours of performances, theater, dancing from literary groups all over the country, cultural groups all over the country. Is that going to be going on May Day? And what are the plans for May Day 2020?
There won't be massive rallies for social distancing reasons. KCTU, our national center, has called for dispersed small-scale protests around the country, which will be on social media in various forms. The main demands are moratorium on dismissals, protection of employment, expansion of the social safety net. Those are the main demands. And our KPTU, our union, will have a rally of maybe 500 people in Seoul, at Seoul Station, maybe a little bit less, which is a very small scale for us for May Day. And around similar demands, as well as our demands in healthcare and around expansion of public services and public healthcare. And then because we're having, the biggest brunt of the employment crisis is hitting aviation, airline, and airport workers, we'll march from Seoul's station, which is a train station, to the headquarters of Korean Airlines to call for responsibility and to stop layoffs. So for subcontracting workers as well as permanently employed workers, and the conditions on aviation companies to, do the right thing and protect workers and not their dividends and their executive pay. So that's our plans.
And you'll be streaming. I know that the Korean unions have used streaming as a important vehicle for education about your struggles and your issues.
I understand KCTU will have a live streaming channel, and so I will send that to you when I get it. It may be put out the day of, so I will send it to you when I can. KP2, I don't think we're live streaming, but there will be images and videos available.
Okay, well, American workers, I think, can join with Korean workers on May Day on an International Day of Action for survival against COVID and against the system that continues to exploit workers in Korea and the United States and around the world. So thanks for joining us on WorkWeek, Wol-san.
Yep. Thank you, Steve.